Further ado, I am delighted to welcome my friend and a previous Levy lecture speaker, Anette Isaacs. She has created a business as an authority on German culture and history, and she's well-spoken and completely talented. So Anette, take it away.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And thank you, everybody. I'm so delighted to see 316 people who want to know about Beethoven. And you know why you want to know it? Because tomorrow actually is his 250th birthday. And that is so incredible when you think of it. And of course, you all have at one point in your life seen this painting here. This is a painting that, as you can see here, was created 200 years ago this year by the German painter Joseph Karl Stieler. And Beethoven himself, by the way, not always the most charming of all contemporaries, he liked this portrait of himself very much, and he thought it depicted him quite accurately. To say that Ludwig van Beethoven is legendary is really putting it mildly. He might even be the ultimate universal cultural icon. I mean, if 200 years after your death, people are buying rubber duckies in your likeness, or chocolate cake, or cookies or whatever, so chocolate and cake and everything, then certainly you have done something right. And if you take a look at the rubber duckies, it is really quite tremendous, right? That you look at them and you immediately say, oh, look, Beethoven as a rubber ducky. I am not a musicologist, I am a historian, and that is why I dedicated this presentation to the man behind the music. You know, what was Ludwig van Beethoven really like? What do we know about this enigmatic genius? Well, the first thing that we know is that he was born 250 years ago, and he was born in the little city of Bonn. As you can see here, Bonn is in the far west of Germany, and it is very close to the Netherlands, to Belgium, and which is going to become quite important in our story a little later, to France. It's very close to France as well. Bonn had about 1,100 houses, about 11,000 inhabitants at the time when Beethoven was born. It was a city on the smaller side, but it was quite progressive for the times. It had a university, it had a court orchestra, and that court orchestra had a Kapellmeister. Kapellmeister means a musical director. And the Kapellmeister was called Ludwig van Beethoven. Wait a minute, who is this Ludwig? Well, it's not our Ludwig, it's our Ludwig's grandfather, because he hailed originally from Belgium. And in 1733, he moved to Bonn to join that court orchestra to play the bass. And then later on, in 1761, he took on the position as the musical director. And he had a son, this is Johann, and Johann was a singer, he was a tenor, who also worked at that court orchestra. And he was married to Maria Magdalena, as you can see here. And these two had 7 children, only 3 of them reached adulthood. The oldest surviving child was a boy who came into this world on December 16th to 1770, and he was baptized one day later. And look, here we have the baptism registry. If you take a look to the kind of left side of your screen, you see Beethoven, there he is. And this is the house where he was born. And then this is also the house where he would grow up in. And here we see it. That is, of course, nowadays the Beethoven Museum in Bonn. You can imagine that everybody who lives in that city is extremely proud, you know, of their connection with this very, very famous composer. This house, though, did not really belong to the Beethoven family. It belonged to the town baker. And the town baker was actually saying, I'm not going to allow you people to practice music in the afternoons because I am working in the morning. And so in the afternoons, I have to take my well-deserved nap. The Beethovens also didn't live in the front of the house. They lived in the garden house that you can see here. of course, a family of musicians. What do they need? They need instruments. And here we have, these are not Beethoven's instruments, but I wanted to include them so that you see what a cembalo in the late 18th century looked like, and a clavichord looked like. So the cembalo they had in the living room, and the clavichord was in the boys' bedroom. Ludwig had two little brothers. One was Karl. Karl was 4 years younger, and Johann Jr. was 6 years younger. Karl eventually became a civil servant, and Johann Jr., it's quite funny, he actually became known as the richest Beethoven because he was a pharmacist. And you might think, how can that be? You know, how can he be richer than the most important musician? Well, yeah, that's a pharmacist was at that time already making quite a bit of money. So you can imagine young Ludwig inherited his family's musical genes and then some. You know, he displayed a tremendous amount of talent at a very early age. And he adored his grandfather. And he was just heartbroken when the older Ludwig died in 1773. The Kapellmeister did leave a nice inheritance on which the family was able to live modestly, one could say, for the time being, but it was a nice support, you know, when it comes, of course, to the fact that Johann von Beethoven, who was the father, he was not particularly successful in his profession as a singer. And the other thing also was that he had an alcohol problem. So he became an alcoholic, and the alcoholism became worse as time went on. And so he did, of course, realize that his oldest son was extremely talented. And so he thought, I'm going to turn him into the original Wunderkind. And that is, of course, Mozart, who was at the time, Mozart was 14 years older than Beethoven. So everybody at the time, of course, knew about Mozart. You know, many people had seen him perform. And he was just such a Wunderkind, like a miracle child, a prodigy. And so in order to establish the Wunderkind reputation, Johann resorted to interesting means, for example, and now I would like for you to do the math. So now we are, as you know, Beethoven was born in 1770. Okay, on March 26, 1778, little Ludwig performed his first piano concert in Cologne, just neighboring the city of Bonn. And the posters for this event advertised him as a 6-year-old Wunderkind. So wait a minute. If that concert was in 1778, Beethoven was not 6. But of course, that was a little lie that the father told, you know, but even, you know, without the fibbing, or with the fibbing, basically, people realized that that talented young boy would go far in life. Johann tried to be his son's only music teacher, but very early on, he recognized that he was no match for young Ludwig's superior abilities. For example, he hated his son's constant improvising on the piano, and he wasn't really realizing that what Ludwig was doing was he was creating his or kind of finding, you know, his own unique musical voice. He was composing, and so he always thought that Ludwig was you know, disobedient, and then the two would get into these terrible fights. And young Ludwig was a very headstrong child. He had frequent emotional outbursts. They had a neighbor, the Beethovens, and this is this neighbor, Helene von Breuning. And Helene actually came up with a word for these emotional outbursts. So she created a word, and the word is rapti. And she would always say, oh my God, Ludwig has his bhakti again. And so we will, in the course of this presentation, hear about some of the raptis that Ludwig van Beethoven had, because he was not somebody who was tolerating incompetence. And so he also had an interesting, somewhat unusual outward appearance for the times. He was darker than the typical Germans in this area. And an early bout with chickenpox left his face a little scarred. He had like a darker complexion and also brown eyes, and that earned him the nickname Spaniol. Spaniol, of course, being a person from Spain, which of course he wasn't, as we know, because he was a German person who had a family that came from Belgium. As mentioned, Johann van Beethoven realized pretty early on that Ludwig needed professional teachers, and that is why he hired composer Christian Gottlob Neefe, who was a celebrated organist in that court orchestra in Bonn. Ludwig was in good hands because Neefe not only helped him perfect his piano playing and his viola playing. Not everybody knows that Beethoven was also a very virtuoso viola player, but he, of course, also taught him the fundamentals of music composition. And then when Ludwig was 12 years old, he even became Neefe's substitute in the court orchestra as the deputy organ player. So every time that Neefe was out of town or otherwise unavailable, 12-year-old Ludwig was playing the organ and he was making a little money. All in all, though, one has to say young Ludwig's childhood was not a happy one. The boy suffered most under his father's alcohol-induced mood swings, and it would happen rather frequently that after a night of partying in the taverns, Johann van Beethoven would come home, usually in the middle of the night, with some equally inebriated friends, and they would chase little Ludwig out of bed and force the sleepy boy to entertain them on the piano for several hours. In the early 1780s, something interesting happened on the political stage that would send our now teenaged Beethoven's life onto a new trajectory. And that was this: Maximilian Franz. Maximilian Franz was the youngest son of Maria Theresia, of the Austrian emperors. And so these were people from the Habsburg dynasty, and they were, of course, quite powerful. And so Maximilian Franz, became the Elector of Bonn in 1784. So he moved to Bonn, and the ruler met young Ludwig, and he was quite impressed by Ludwig's musical talent. And so through his connection, because you remember, he is from Vienna, he's from the Habsburg family. So Maximilian Franz, actually through his connections, through his wealth, he was able to actually support Ludwig and give him the first, enable him to travel to Vienna, because that was the first big trip of his lifetime. And so Vienna at the time was already a hub, of classical music. And it was a big city. It had 200,000 people who were living there. So Ludwig had just turned 16 when he traveled all the way from Bonn to Vienna. Nowadays, if you would have a car and if you would drive on the German Autobahn, this would only take you 8 hours. But at that point in history, it took him 10 days. And it was supposed to be a study trip, and Maximilian Franz told Ludwig that he definitely should get some music lessons from the original Wunderkind, which was, of course, Mozart, who had just turned 30. As you can imagine, there are countless biographies about Beethoven in existence. There are countless biographies about Mozart in existence, and the authors are usually divided into two camps. The one camp is adamant that those two actually did meet. And then the other camp is as adamant about the fact that they think, no, they never met. So I would say, for the sake of the beauty of our story, let's just hope that they did meet, because, people in the later 19th century actually had this idea. They really did believe that they did meet, as this painting here suggests. And there was also an alleged eyewitness at that supposed meeting. And this eyewitness said that when Beethoven played one of his own compositions for Mozart, the Austrian genius was at first a bit bored. But then when Mozart gave Beethoven one of his own melodies, and then the 16-year-old was proceeding to improvise on Mozart's melody, Mozart was getting really impressed. And he exclaimed auspiciously, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." Young Ludwig van Beethoven loved the energy of the big city. He had a wonderful time there for 3 months. Oh, and then his father sends him a letter. And in that letter, his father says, you have to come home because your mother had just, she has fallen ill with tuberculosis and she's not doing well. So frantically, of course, Ludwig travels back to Bonn and he is able to see his mother before she dies, but she does pass away in July of 1787 at age 40. Can you imagine? That's so young when you think of it. Shortly after her death, the distraught son wrote a letter to a friend, and he described his mother as, and I quote, such a good, lovely mother, my best friend. So here he was, back in Bonn. He was barely 17 years old, with a father now finding himself totally in the grip of alcoholism, and two little brothers, who of course needed his guidance and his support. So Ludwig was thinking, what am I doing now? And so he did what he thought was the right thing. And he applied for a position of viola player at the court orchestra in his hometown. And he even became the legal guardian of his siblings. And he managed to convince the judge to actually seize 50% of his father's salary so that that Ludwig would actually get it, so that he was able to cover the living expenses for the family, because Ludwig did not want his father to spend all the money on wine and on alcohol. Remember that in the beginning, I said that, Bonn's proximity to France is going to play a role in that story. What happens in 1789? Of course, the big date, that's the French Revolution. And who is emerging out of that French Revolution as an important leader? It is, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. So it is certainly no stretch of the imagination to actually think that you have this young man, Ludwig, who is really only 19 years old and who is just like, who adores the fact, first of all, the French Revolution, the ideals of the revolution, who are, of course, liberty, fraternity, and especially equality. But then he was also excited about the man who tried to bring these world-shattering ideas to other European countries during the Revolutionary Wars in the 1790s. And so it really is true. I mean, Beethoven lived through a highly political time that was mostly represented by this amazing transformation process. Because first of all, you have this transition, of human beings having been mere subjects of a king or of a prince for like hundreds of years. And now it changes, it transitions into this era that they are now becoming free and independent citizens, which is, of course, a tremendous societal change and a progress. And so consequently, living through the French Revolution certainly impressed Ludwig tremendously. Who came to Bonn in 1790? No, it wasn't Napoleon yet. It was this man. It was Joseph Haydn, very famous composer and also Mozart's teacher. Joseph Haydn was on his way to London. As you might know, he did a lot of work in London. And so he did a stopover in Bonn, and he met with his friend, of course, Maximilian Franz. And those two were talking about Beethoven. So Haydn said, hey, I'd like to meet this young man. And so he did. And so then he was so impressed by Beethoven that he said, you know what, if I'm coming back to Bonn, you should also come to Bonn because I can give you lessons. And then, of course, Beethoven was really excited. And he said, sure, I'm coming to Bonn again, to Vienna again. But who's going to pay for it? Of course, the whole study trip is going to be expensive. And so that is when one of many patrons were coming into Beethoven's life. And this is Count von Waldstein. Count von Waldstein was an interesting man because he grew up in Vienna, so he had properties there, but he also lived in Bonn at the time. So, and then he provided Beethoven not only with the money to go on that study trip, but also with this wonderful note. Look at that. Dear Beethoven, you go to realize a long desired wish. The genius of Mozart is still in mourning and weeps for the death of its disciple. By incessant application, receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. Isn't that beautiful? And so, of course, in 1804, maybe some of you are recognizing the name Waldstein, because, of course, in 1804, Beethoven would compose the famous Waldstein Sonata. And that is also called the Sonata number 21 in C major. And that is, of course, in order to thank his friend. It's dedicated to Waldstein. Let's just listen for like a minute, and see what that is all about, the Waldstein Sonata. Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. Dubravka Tomsik is playing it maybe a little too fast. I don't know in how far you are Beethoven experts, but that is the Waldstein Sonata is supposed to be fast, but that's like lightning, lightning fast. So in November of 1792, there he is again. 10 days, as you know, here 8 hours nowadays. He is traveling again to Vienna, the beautiful Vienna that he loves so much. And then, and the other thing is also Mozart had died. He had passed away the previous November. And so then at that point, which is very interesting, at that point, when Beethoven travels to Vienna, he has no idea that he would never see Bonn again. He never returned to Bonn. One of the reasons for this, or the major reason basically, is that in 1794, the French army, so because now, Napoleon is showing his real character, because you have the French army that is occupying the Rhineland. And so the elector, Maximilian Franz, and his entire court have to flee the area. And that meant that Beethoven's job, at that court orchestra was in a way made redundant. He didn't have a job anymore. And then the other thing also was that just a couple of months after he had arrived in Vienna, his father passed away. And that kind of shows the fraught relationship of these two men, because Beethoven did not go back to Bonn to attend the funeral. He did, though, ask for his two brothers to actually join him in Vienna. And he did say to Johann, to the youngest brother, if you want to go to pharmacy school, you can also do it here in Austria. You don't have to do it in Germany. And so that's what he did. And then later on, Johann did open up a very successful pharmacy business in Linz, which is about 130 miles west of Vienna. So with, again, the 200,000 inhabitants, Vienna was still a very exciting place. And Ludwig, as you know, was there because he wanted to see Haydn and he wanted to have instruction from Haydn. And it was really quite nice. The two men got along very well. But, Haydn was a successful, very busy man, so he couldn't dedicate himself fully to young Ludwig. And so that is why, because Ludwig was like a sponge, he wanted to learn so much. And so that is why behind Haydn's back, Ludwig enlisted the help of Italian composer and Mozart nemesis Antonio Salieri as a teacher. And so he helped him with the counterpoint, which of course is also a composition technique. And in addition, von Beethoven also met and befriended in another patron, and this is this man, Count Karl von Lichnowsky, who provided the young musician with a place to stay and with some spending money. Beethoven cut his teeth in Vienna's spirited music scene by performing in piano competitions in the Austrian capital. It was almost like a boxing match, but of course the artists were sparring with pianos and not with fists. And he was actually quite successful doing that. He usually left his rivals in the dust, and he was soon known as an exciting newcomer whose audacity and virtuoso playing impressed the aristocracy quite deeply. The one thing, though, that was still a problem was that people didn't really quite know what to make out of his music, out of his composition style, because he was not like Mozart. He was not playful. His music, as I always say, his music has the sense of urgency. It's a music that is powerful, and people were taken aback a little bit by it. And then the other thing also was that although he was revered in Vienna, he never really got his due in that sense, because he was, as a performer, he was considered almost the help. He was considered entertainment, and not much more than a servant. And you can imagine that such a proud, stubborn personality did not like this at all. And he was a supporter of the equality creed of the revolutionary times. And so that's why Beethoven had a hard time reconciling the fact that on the one hand, he was yearning to live in a free and egalitarian society, but then on the other hand, he was so financially dependent on the nobility. And the nobility, of course, enjoyed a seemingly easy and privileged existence just because of having been born into this higher class. And sometimes his rapti, and look what a wonderful caricature from 1987 that really shows, his rapti, his eruptions always. They got the best of him, and he would snap. Like, for example, there was a moment where he was performing in a salon. And so while he was performing, behind him, there were three noblemen who were talking, kept talking while he was performing. And that enraged him so much that during the performance, he got so agitated that he stormed out of the room with the words, "I'm not playing for these pigs." One also has to say, low self-esteem was not one of Beethoven's problems. He brashly once told his patron and landlord of the first hour, we have Count von Lichnowsky, he said, "Prince, what you are through chance and birth. What I'm through my own labor. There are many princes, and there will continue to be thousands more, but there's only one Beethoven." And it was this unapologetic, audacious personality that was also responsible for Beethoven's adulation for this man here, of course, for Napoleon Bonaparte. And so he, in the very early 19th century, he actually dedicated his very vibrant, beautiful Third Symphony to his hero. The Third Symphony is really a beautiful piece. Let's just listen in for a second. yeah, you can really feel the power that is behind this music. And so he also, he dedicated it to Napoleon. And he also actually toyed with the idea of moving to Paris. So he said, you know what, Vienna is stuffy. I'm going to go to Paris because that's going to be the cat's meow, so to speak. But just imagine his surprise and his shock, frankly, when in December of 1804, this happened. The soldier who had started out really as the common man, as a hero for the common man, did the unthinkable and crowned himself emperor. When a friend told him this distressing news, Beethoven got so mad, got so agitated, and he screamed and he said, "Is he then too nothing more than an ordinary human being? Now he too will trample on all the rights of men and indulge only his ambition. He will exalt himself above all others, become a tyrant." And full of rage, Beethoven grabs a knife and he walks over to the original score of the Third Symphony. And look what he did. He actually is scratching out the written for Bonaparte part. So it's really quite incredible that we have that, that we have a picture of that, of the original score of the Third Symphony, and you see these little holes. So that was Beethoven himself, because he scratches out written for Bonaparte. And then the symphony was instead called Eroica, and it was first publicly performed in 1805. And needless to say, he really canceled his plans to move to Paris. A few years, before Ludwig started to compose the Eroica, he was in his late 20s at the time, he noticed a slight ringing in his ears and a very faint inability to understand people. There is this story that in the early years, he went on a walk with a friend, and while they were chatting with each other, the friend was saying, "Oh, wait, do you hear the shepherd? He's really singing quite nicely in the distance." And Beethoven was trying to hear a shepherd in the distance, but he couldn't. There was no shepherd in the distance. And so he thought that the friend was putting him on. But then soon the symptoms became more severe, and the tinnitus, of course, you know what that is, this this very, very high noise in your ear, that became almost permanent. And if you think about the fact that Beethoven was such a high-strung person, and then he has this tinnitus constantly in his ear, it must have driven him absolutely mad. So he referred to his gradual deafness as "my secret demon." Initially, he of course didn't want anybody to know about it, because how ridiculous would that have been? A deaf musician? He was sure that this would certainly impact his ability to work in his chosen profession, let alone make a living from doing it. So he began avoiding his friends and isolated himself more and more. And sadly, his deafness was not the only health problem that he had. Even as a young man, he suffered from colics, from frequent nausea, bouts with depression. So a doctor said, "You need to take a time out. You have to get yourself a little place in the countryside." And so that's exactly what he did in the summer of 1802. He rented a little apartment in Heiligenstadt. Heiligenstadt is nowadays, as you can see, a suburb of Vienna. At that time, it was in the outskirts of town. So you can see he didn't go very far. And that's where he actually wrote the so-called Heiligenstadt Testament, which you can see here. It's a letter to his brothers. And it is really a fascinating look into Beethoven's inner struggle. And if you are interested in digging deeper when it comes to this particular life story, I really recommend you read this. You can find that on the internet. There are a lot of important, also quite heartbreaking passages, like when he tries to explain his increasingly eccentric behavior. And he's basically, for the first time, really revealing the impact, the devastating impact that this progressive deafness has on him. Like, for example, in this passage here, "How could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than others? A sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or ever have enjoyed. Oh, I cannot do it." Therefore, forgive me when you see me draw back, when I would have gladly mingled with you. He writes that the despair concerning his situation even made him contemplate suicide. But then, he says, it was only my art that held me back. The Heiligenstadt Testament is so interesting because it starts out in a tone of resignation, but then, especially, when he then talks about contemplating suicide, but then when he says it was only my art that held me back, then it changes, then he makes kind of a 180 and it changes into defiant inspiration. And so he decides, of course, not to kill himself, but to fight against his fate. And he would later write encouraging messages, almost like affirmations. He would write that on the margins of his scores, and they look like seemingly spontaneously done. Like, for example, some researchers found a score that had on the margins written, and I quote, "I will reach into fate's throat. It certainly shall not burn me down completely." Have you ever heard a more Beethoven-y sentence than that? One has to say, Beethoven dealt with his deafness in a very constructive manner. He consulted countless doctors. He tried out every possible therapy. Later on, he had listening devices that were made for him. He had contraptions that were created for him. And that, in the beginning, it did help a little. One also has to say that this really was a gradual disease. It took about 20 years for him to become completely deaf. One doesn't really know the reason why. Some researchers think it was a virus. Others actually think it was poison, lead poisoning. And then the afflicted himself actually had a theory, but that's, I don't know if that's such a true theory. The thing was that he thought it had to do with his rupti, because he was, he remembered that at one point he had a rehearsal with an orchestra, and there were these two violinists who did just not play how he wanted them to play. And so he got so mad that he screamed at them from the top of his lungs, and then he said, and then the next day I couldn't hear anything. So, I mean, that sounds very highly unlikely. But what is so fascinating is that actually his deafness finally turns him into a real life composer, right? Because because he's realizing he's not going to be able to be a piano virtuoso anymore. And that's why he has to dedicate himself to creating music rather than performing music. And so it sounds a little cynical, but it really is true. Beethoven's diminishing hearing capacity let his body of work blossom. And that already starts, when he comes back to Vienna from Heiligenstadt in 1802, where he then has this decade, really, from 1802 to 1812, that is characterized by an amazing creative output. In these 10 years, he creates 6 big symphonies and altogether 15 very iconic pieces that are adored by every classical music lover in the world. I mean, you don't even have to know anything about reading music, but you will know what that is. The world famous 4 notes. Da, 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 da. Of course, the Fifth Symphony. And of course, who would we be without listening to a little bit to this Fifth Symphony? this. This was 90 seconds. Didn't it just sound, I mean, it sounds so incredibly like huge, this is big music, for 90 seconds. Incredible. Yeah. So, and then we have December of 1808. So he is 38 and he organizes one of his greatest concerts ever. And they didn't actually call it concert. They called it academy at this point in history. And that was here at the Theater under Wien in Vienna. And you would think, that's not a very huge theater. I mean, with little house. Well, let me show you what it looked like from the inside. So this was a couple of days before Christmas. It was sold out. And of course, they didn't have any central heating back then. So that is, and plus the other thing is, this concert was really long. It was like 4 hours long. But the people there who were at that concert, they were treated to the premieres of the Fifth Symphony, the premieres of the Sixth Symphony, which of course we all know under the name Pastoral, and then my favorite piece, that would be the Fourth Piano Concerto. And Beethoven himself played it, the Fourth Piano Concerto. And so, yeah, let's just listen in. We have the Met Orchestra with James Levine and Evgeny Kissin. And this is really, it's a live performance, so it gives us a little color, little tone also. So beautiful, so passionate. While he was doing that in 1808, his deafness was kind of an open secret, in Viennese high society. He did perform, though, until 1815-ish. But then he was really so hard of hearing that some awkward moments happened, like, for example, he wasn't able to hear the other musicians. So he missed, his tact, when he should go in, or he banged way too loudly on the piano keys. So it didn't work anymore, and he realized that his days as a pianist were really over. But, it's just really fascinating to actually think about his creative process, because he got his inspiration on nature walks. Every day he did a big walk, and he always would bring a booklet with him so that he could write down his ideas. And then if he didn't have this booklet with him, then he got very inventive and resourceful. In restaurants, for example, he would ask for napkins, and then he would write down, and these were not, of course, paper napkins, these were, of course, cloth napkins at the time. And so, what I thought was the greatest thing was that some of his former landlords found musical notes etched into a windowsill and even on the back of his shutters for his windows. So speaking of landlords, Beethoven was notorious in Vienna for having been a horrible renter. He moved so many times. He was in Vienna for 35 years, but in those 35 years, he had 50 different addresses. And he was a nightmare, especially later on, when his deafness was causing him to become even more eccentric than usual. For example, if he was getting tired from composing, he used to keep like a big bucket of water next to him, next to the piano. And he would work. And then when he realized, oh, I'm getting tired, he would take this big bucket of water and he would pour it over himself in order to make himself alert again. And of course, the water would splash everywhere. It would seep into the floorboards, and it would bother the neighbors who were living underneath him. Oh my God! But it really is a very interesting and very enjoyable undertaking as a historian to do research on him. I mean, the museum in Bonn, the museum in Vienna, they have all of these wonderful things. Oh, it just told me that my internet connection is a little bit unstable. I hope that you are able to hear me. So let's take a look at this, because this is quite fascinating. We have, for example, 70 composition books filled with 8,000 pages. And if you take a look at these composition books, you do realize that actually composing is hard work for Beethoven. He is not one of these geniuses that kind of has this divine inspiration and just needs to commit it to paper. Look at that. You see that he is wrestling really with the melodies. He writes down notes, he writes down melodies, he rejects them, he crosses them out, he adds addendums, corrections, footnotes. Take a look at this. Can you imagine being his music publisher or being a copyist who has to make sense out of that? It's pretty astonishing when you think of it. So Beethoven really, there you can also see like this tortured soul, Here we have a recreation of what his apartment in Vienna looked like. Beethoven had an interesting daily routine. So he would get out of bed usually between 5 and 6 a.m. And then he would make himself a cup of coffee. And this cup of coffee was special because the cup of coffee had 16 coffee beans. Don't give me 15 and don't give me 17. I want 16 coffee beans. So that was very important to him. Every evening, the previous evening, he would count the 16 coffee beans religiously because he had once read that that was the perfect amount of coffee beans. And then most mornings he would work from home. He would even be in his study or, of course, at the piano. So take a look at this. This is very interesting because this was created for him. It is like a listening device kind of thing that you put it on your piano, and then it's almost like an echo chamber, because it makes the sound coming up from the piano a little louder. And in addition, he had, of course, a collection of ear horns. There you see them, or also ear trumpets. These are those. And in the beginning, they provided some support. They provided some help, but not, in the last decade of his life, he was completely deaf. So that didn't help. And so then before lunch, Beethoven would go on one of these long walks, and then between noon and 2 p.m., he would have lunch. He was never married, as we know, but he had a maid. Fish, he liked fish dishes a lot, and also bread soup, like soup. And so in the afternoons, he would then work a little bit more, and then he would have another cup of coffee with 16 coffee beans. And then after dinner, he would go to either a concert or a theater or an opera. And, we have heard a lot about, oh yeah, and then let me show you. And then at 10, he would go to bed. And here we have his night pod. That's Beethoven's night pod. I sometimes think, is it too much information that I'm giving you? But yes, so we have heard a lot about his difficult character, and he was so mean. Well, there were also a lot of contemporaries who liked him a lot and who were his friends. And so they said that he was a positive person, he was a generous person, he was a benevolent person. And he did have great friendships, and he had a sarcastic, often witty sense of humor, for example, especially when it comes to his brothers. So here we have his younger brother, Johann, the pharmacist. And the pharmacist was a successful man, but he also, he flaunted it, which Beethoven never liked. And so one time, Johann bought himself a beautiful estate outside of Vienna, and he wrote Beethoven a letter, and he signed the letter with the words, "From your brother Johann, landowner." And of course, Beethoven was rolling his eyes, and he was then writing him a letter back, and he signed the letter, and he said, "From your brother Ludwig, brain owner." I thought that was so funny. In 1812, Beethoven's friends asked him to pose for a life mask in order to create a prototype for a bust that they were planning to produce. And look at this greatest of all picture. I'm so excited about this picture every time when I see it, because it is so lifelike, and it shows us exactly what he looked like when he was 42. And here you see it there also, and you see, the little scars that he had from the chicken pox. So, I personally, I like him. I thought he was kind of cute with his hair and everything, but I'm maybe the only one, because usually women at the time were screaming and running away when he came around the corner. So that brings us to the question: was Beethoven? Did he have a love life at all? And well, what I have to say, he was never married, of course, but he found himself in love all the time. But mostly it was unrequited love. And then of course it also had to do with the fact that he usually, especially as a performer, as an artist, he was usually meeting a lot of women who were aristocratic women, and they of course were never able to enter into a relationship with him, because it would have been way too difficult, And then of course also his reputation as a hothead, was also a problem. There was this one woman, though, that she was the one who got away, and that is Josephine von Brunswick, as we can see here. She originally comes from the Brunswick family. They were in Hungary. And so she had a sister by the name of Therese, and they took piano lessons from Ludwig in 1799. And they already, while they were taking piano lessons from Ludwig, she liked him quite a bit. And Josephine, though, she had to marry a man, who was an aristocratic man. And so that broke Beethoven's heart. She did end up liking that man, who was 20 years her senior, and she had a couple of children with this man. But unfortunately, he died, only after like 4 or 5 years of marriage. And so then from 1804 throughout the next decade, she drifted in and out of Beethoven's life. She did have to marry another man at the end of the decade, about 1810-ish, and that was a terrible man. So he treated her terribly. But she and Beethoven, they did spend quite a bit of time in Josephine's mansion there, or not mansion, castle, basically. And this is what it looked like. Look at that. That's a beautiful little thing. Everybody wants to live there. And here we have another view of it. And so it's interesting, because in 1808, she actually writes Beethoven, and she says, "I would have to hurt holy bonds if I would give in to your longing. Believe me, I'm suffering the most for having to fulfill my duties." And the interesting thing about that was, of course, that if Josephine, as a aristocratic woman, if she would have married also Ludwig, first of all, she would have lost her aristocratic title. And the other thing was, she also would have lost custody of her children. And of course, that's why she could never really have like an open relationship that would be out in the open with him. Something interesting happened, though, in the summer of 1812. And that was when Beethoven wanted to take, or was taking a little vacation in the beautiful spa town of Teplitz. Teplitz was in Bohemia, and you can see, very beautiful. And guess who he bumped into there? Josephine, as you can see here in a stylized painting as a goddess. So to be perfectly correct, we don't really know if the two really did bump into each other in Teplitz. What we do know, though, is that the next day, we do know that she is in Teplitz. She was in Teplitz, but did she meet Beethoven? That's the big question. Because the next day, Beethoven writes the famous immortal beloved letter. And that is this letter that really is counted as one of the most beautiful love letters ever written. And you would think, yeah, well, what's the problem with it? Well, the big problem with it is that it's not addressed to anybody. It's only addressed to the immortal beloved. And of course, we don't know who that is. So for the last almost 200 years, countless historians and researchers have tried to decipher who exactly was this person. And so nowadays, one can say a lot of fingers are pointing to Josephine. There is also another interesting development, and that was that after exactly 9 months, she was giving birth to a girl. And she called the girl Minona. And if you take the word Minona and you read it backwards, what you get the German word anonym, which means anonymous. And so who knows, and here we have a picture of Minona. She looks a little brooding, so we don't know, is she Beethoven's illegitimate daughter? We don't know. What we do know, though, is that the terrible second husband was treating Josephine terribly. He left her destitute. He took all her children away from her. She died in 1821. She was completely isolated. She was only 42 years old. And so, she had a terrible life afterwards. But yeah, so that's the question. And then, of course, also Minona, we do know, though, that she was never married. She kind of grew up in Scandinavia, almost in like a convent, so she never had any children. So this, even if she would have been a Beethoven, that whole line didn't go anywhere. A couple of years after this eventful summer, Beethoven's original hero, Napoleon, was finally defeated, and the rulers and diplomats of Europe came together to attend the so-called Congress of Vienna, which tried successfully to repress the revolutionary spirit of the times. The Congress was great for Beethoven because there he was able to actually confirm his superstar status with all of these international princes and kings. And he also created this, Wellington's Victory, which is also known as the Battle Symphony. And that is, I would say, and I say this with love, a hacky piece. It's a tacky, hacky, I don't know how you want to call it. It's dedicated to the English general who defeated Napoleon, and his audiences just adored the Battle Symphony so much they couldn't get enough of it. And the funny thing about it is that Ludwig then later on was embarrassed by it. And he said, I have created so many wonderful pieces, and that is what I'm known for. Let me just show you how that sounds. yeah, did you hear what that is? It's of course Tanya. There's also like a God Save the Queen is in there. It's incredible that he did that. So now that happened yesterday too, that it starts again. So okay, so one would think, with all of the adulation, with all of the success, that Beethoven made a lot of money, during his lifetime. But this was not the case. As we already have seen, it was his brother, the pharmacist, who made much more money. And so there were reasons, why Beethoven's lockbox, this is where he kept his money, why the lockbox sometimes was pretty empty, And so one of the reasons could have been that maybe his patrons, would promise him financial support. And then something would happen to their own fortunes. And so that's why, then they weren't able to give him money. Or maybe his publishers were not liquid. Or maybe one of these concerts that he had organized wasn't sold out. So it was quite interesting. And then there was a little bit of a disparity going on, because on the one hand, he was extremely famous. He was iconic even in his lifetime. And people, of course, people admired him. And you could buy, look, these are contemporary illustrations that they were printed in music magazines and music books, and people were buying these. They were sometimes even putting them, like, for example, when we were teenagers, we had posters of our big stars on our walls, and people did the same thing. But on the other hand, especially when it comes to his later work, people were overwhelmed by his music, and not in a good way, especially then in the 1820s. The music that was famous in the 1820s was Italian music, and it was opera. For example, Rossini was a celebrated composer when it comes to the Viennese music scene. And then, of course, opera, we know Beethoven was not an opera composer. He created one opera, which is, of course, Fidelio. And Fidelio was not a great commercial success. And to make things even more complicated for him was that from 1815 on, he was consumed by a private matter that demanded most of his energy and attention. And that had to do with his nephew. So this was Karl. So his brother Karl dies in 1815 of tuberculosis. And he has this 9-year-old child by the name of Karl as well. And so Beethoven says, okay, I'm going to adopt him. But, there's a problem with that. And that is that Karl has a mother, and she's very capable of taking care of the child. But Beethoven hates her. Beethoven, they had a falling out shortly after this little boy was born. And so Beethoven wasn't even in contact for the last 8 or so years with this side of his family, because he hated his sister-in-law so much. And so he involved the sister-in-law in a custody battle that was drawn out, that cost a lot of money, that was very crazy, because, for example, he would win custody and then she would sue him. And then she would win custody. And then he would sue her. And then the judge would say, you are both crazy. I'm going to now award you what is that? Like custody, like both of you are going to have custody. And then they were both, of course, losing their minds because they hated each other so much. And all of this is happening while he is completely deaf. This is done from 1815 on. And the only way that people can talk to him is by writing their ideas and their sentences, what they want to tell him, into the conversation booklets. And so here, this is exactly what that is. You have another picture of a conversation book. So people would write down what they wanted to tell him, and then he would answer. And so all of this, the boy was, of course, very traumatized. He had lost his father. And then now he has this kind of weird uncle, who doesn't hear anything and who is so curmudgeonly all the time. And then, of course, also one has to say, this is really terrible, that Beethoven succumbed to his father's demon, to the alcohol. So he also becomes somebody who drinks a lot. For example, 3 bottles of wine per day. He did that for years, and he let himself go. There is one moment actually where he walks on one of his big walks. He is being picked up by the police in Vienna because they think he's a homeless person. You can imagine how embarrassing that was for the police of Vienna when that misunderstanding was finally cleared up. Moreover, Beethoven had so many other ailments that he was battling in addition to the deafness, like, for example, recurring fevers, headaches, stomach ailments, rheumatic fever, jaundice, debilitating liver disease. And all of this was happening while he was creating two of the most sublime pieces of his entire opus. And one is, of course, the Missa Solemnis, and then the other one, of course, the Ode to Joy, the Ninth Symphony. When the Ode to Joy premiered in May of 1824, it immediately became a milestone in music history. And we also know why, because for the first time, a symphony included voices. So let's just quickly hear. It was, of course, sold out, and the people they were so crazy in that theater, they were so loud that the police commissioner had to quiet them down. And so the applause at the end was really absolutely incredible. And so unfortunately, though, our poor Beethoven wasn't able to hear it, you know, and to see it, because he had been standing with his back to the audience, because he had, of course, stood there next to the conductor, and he was looking at all the musicians. And then one of his assistants was turning him around, and then he saw, you know, all this adulation and this love from the audience. And so he just, you know, he took a bow quietly, and that was the last time that he made a public appearance. And so then, of course, he has this Karl, you know, his nephew, who grows up and who wants to commit suicide. So Karl is trying to commit suicide by shooting himself in the head in 1826. And he does it twice. He shoots himself in the head twice, but he survives. And then while he's in the hospital, of course, Ludwig runs to the hospital because he wants to be with his nephew. And then when Karl sees Ludwig come around the corner there to his room, he says to the nurse, he says, "Get me my mother." Isn't that such an insult? You know, after all that has transpired, now he wants his mom when he sees his uncle come. In early 1827, Ludwig and a mostly recovered Karl visited his pharmacist brother in that estate there outside of Vienna. And as so often, you know, these wacky Beethovens, as so often they get into this huge fight. And then Beethoven says, "I am leaving." Or basically, we are leaving. And then Johann says, "Okay, you can leave, but I'm not giving you my carriage." He had, of course, a beautiful carriage. This is January or February. It's very cold. And so Beethoven says, "We don't need your carriage. We get our own transportation back to Vienna." And then, of course, the problem is that Beethoven didn't really find a really good, warm carriage. So they had more like a kind of a sleigh kind of thing, you know, didn't have a carriage, didn't have like a roof. And so that is why he got pneumonia. And so this is the house where he lay dying basically for several weeks. And then on March 26th, 1827, there was a thunderstorm raging over Vienna. And earlier that day, Beethoven had received a shipment of wine from Germany's Rhine Valley region. And so upon seeing the wine, Beethoven said, "Oh, too bad, too late. and then he fell in and out of consciousness. So for the last, for a couple of hours more. And then when a loud bolt of lightning occurred, the 56-year-old clenched his fist, and in a last gesture of defiance, he raised his arm into the air, and then he died. And so this is his death mask. And you know, although he hadn't been in the immediately public consciousness for a number of years, the news of his passing sparked a wave of devastation. Look at his funeral procession. 20,000 people were there. And then here we have his grave in Vienna. And of course, he had already, in the Heiligenstadt Testament, he had already said, I would like to have an autopsy done. And then the autopsy was done. And it showed that it was probably the liver disease that killed him. And to no surprise for anybody, his auditory nerves were destroyed. So of course, obviously, if you can't hear anything, you have a problem with your auditory nerves. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the story even gets a Chicago connection, which is so exciting. Because look, in the 1990s, a lock of his hair was examined by scientists in Naperville, of all places, and they found out that Beethoven's hair contained an average of 42 times more lead than the control samples did. So Ludwig must have been massively poisoned by lead at the time of his death, and maybe also for decades before. So I'm not saying that somebody killed him. It's just that there was so much lead, you know, in the water, and there was so much lead. And women were using lead for makeup. Lead was also used to make wine sweeter. So, and then of course, the other thing is, as we know, lead is also making people aggressive. And then maybe his repti, you know, maybe his emotional outbursts also could be explained by that lead, by that high concentration of lead in his body. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of this genius, you know, who was able to turn his personal tragedy into a fantastic musical triumph. I would like to leave you with a wonderfully fitting quote that one of his biographers, Jan Swafford, said in 2014 when he wrote a 1,000-page tome, and that is the following. In looking back through the course of Beethoven's life as a man, what may be most astonishing about him is that he survived the burden of being Beethoven. So much weighed on him, so much music roiled inside, so much rage, so much delusion, so much anguish, physical and mental. No wonder his time called him superhuman. But the truer and sadder reality is that Beethoven lived to the ultimate capacities of being human. And he encompassed that in his art. As one of the defining figures of a revolutionary age, he witnessed and spoke for all of us a new vision of what it means to be human. So I think all we can say is, happy birthday, you complicated genius. And look at that beautiful memorial there that they have in Bonn. Isn't that great? And then here, look, I love this so much. They actually, in 2020, that's the Beethoven year, you know, and which of course, what a terrible timing when you think of it, because Bonn and also Vienna, they had planned almost 300 events, lectures and concerts, you know, all kinds of events. And so, of course, mostly everything had to be canceled due to the coronavirus. But you can see here in Bonn, they put every green light that is in the city has Beethoven's picture on it. So it's really wonderful. Yes, so let me stop the share so that I can answer some questions.
Annette, that was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. I hope everybody liked it.
It was great. And we've got lots of compliments. Okay, there we are. I have some questions. Really wonderful. Phyllis would like to know, what instrument was Waldstein's sonata played on?
Oh, the Waldstein Sonata? I don't know the exact instrument, but it was, of course, a piano. But I don't know if it was a Steinway or a Bösendorfer or so. But yes, it's a piano.
Okay. Did Beethoven have opinions about contemporary musicians?
I'm not too able to speak about that. I think, that he was somebody who was really very much in his own, universe. But on the other hand, he also liked going to concerts and to theaters. So I don't really know a lot about that.
Okay. Leslie says, can you address the Age of Enlightenment?
The Age of Enlightenment, I think, what is so important when it comes to Beethoven is more when it comes to our German situation, die Sturm und Drang. Because the Sturm und Drang is, and Beethoven is is one of the quintessential artists in Sturm und Drang. What, for example, Schiller and Goethe, our very important national poets, what they are for literature, Beethoven is for music. And this really is this like transition that is really coming then from, and the French Revolution was important not only in France, but also, of course, for this transition that I also talked about in the presentation, from being those the commoner, not commoners, but subjects basically, to becoming an emancipated citizen, and to kind of make the absolute power of the princes and of the emperors, and so kind of take this away and kind of become more self-confident in your own person. And Beethoven really exemplified that quite a bit.
Okay. Claire wonders if perhaps the lead exposure contributed to his hearing loss.
Yeah. So that's what these people, in Naperville, of all places, that's what they are thinking, that because it was so much, it was so much lead. But then again, yesterday, when I was doing this presentation, somebody said, what about his brothers? Did they have hearing problems? And they did not have any hearing problems. So if everybody was kind of drinking the same water, or kind of using this, but then on the other hand, they also were not alcoholics, and Beethoven was drinking a lot. But then, it's so interesting, because he, of course, was already, while he was an alcoholic, it was already done. He was already deaf. Yeah, it's such a mystery, why he did become deaf.
Would it have been from paint, the lead?
It was basically everywhere, especially women, women, when they put their makeup on, there was a lot of lead in there. No wonder everybody died when they were 35.
Okay. Mary would like to know about your process for gathering all of this information into such a stunning presentation. Can you?
Well, the thing is, I do have to tell you that Ludwig and I go way back. So when I was in high school, when I was in 11th grade, which you can imagine was several years ago, I went to an all-girls school, and we had music appreciation. And so our teacher said, okay, now every one of you girls has to find a composer and has to do a term paper. Okay, and then we weren't able to actually select our own, choose our favorite. We were assigned, he said, you do this, you do this. And then I was assigned Johann Sebastian Bach. And I thought, I don't want Johann Sebastian Bach. So I knew that this other girl got Beethoven. And so I badgered her so much. And I said, could I please have Beethoven? And then she said, no, I like Beethoven. You keep your Johann Sebastian Bach. But then I badgered her really so so terribly that she then actually did let me have it. So she let me have Beethoven. And the thing was that at that point, you also had, there were these magazines in Germany that had, that were talking about the life of all these famous composers, but they also had CDs, they were also coming with the magazine. And I had bought the CD, the magazine about Beethoven, and I just loved him so much, and I got an A in my paper, and that was the beginning, of my love for Beethoven. And then, of course, if you for the next like 30 years, and of course, I am a historian, and historians have these huge brains where everything that we are hearing is sticking in the brain. So that's why I will never in my life forget the 16 coffee beans. I had read that many years ago. And so I just kind of put everything together. But I also, of course, read the Jan Swafford book, the 1,000 pages. And and I also liked listening to a lot of music and getting the inspiration there. Like to go to Ravinia when I was still living in Evanston. That was always exciting.
Great. Yeah. Well, your enthusiasm and expert knowledge of the subject clearly comes through, and I'll forward you the comments that people have been sharing, but they're just over the moon happy.
Oh, great.
To know, did he know about his daughter?
Well, that's the big question. Did he know about the daughter? He never really, he never really made any, if he knew, he kept it to himself. And I personally think he didn't know because, this was the same, this was 1812. And then obviously then Minona is born in 1813. And then in 1815, he has, of course, the situation with his brother Carl, that the brother dies. And then you have, of course, the 9-year-old nephew. And so at this point, Beethoven has this huge need, this huge longing of becoming a father, of being a father. And so that is also why he's pursuing this custody battle so much. And so I'm thinking, if he knew that he already had a daughter, maybe he would then also have pursued the daughter, pursued custody of. But then on the other hand, I mean, in 1812, I mean, the mother was married. Would have been such a big scandal. It's a big mystery again. He's shrouded in mystery, that Beethoven.
Does anyone know what happened to that girl? Did she?
Well, she never got married, and most of her life she spent in Scandinavia, and then she passed away. And I don't know how old she was. But but she, of course, she never had any doubt. I mean, she always thought that she, of course, was that her father was that husband of Josephine. I mean, she never thought, maybe I am a Beethoven. That never happened.
Interesting. Okay. When he was totally deaf, how was he able to enjoy going to concerts and theater?
Mostly, these concert and theater situations were mostly happening like before 1815. When he was such a tortured soul in that last decade of his life, and maybe that also has to do, with the alcoholism that then kind of really comes to the forefront. The thing was that he was so upset that he had one piano where he put. He cut the, what is that, like the legs of the piano, he cut them down so that he could put the piano on the floor so that he could hear the vibrations and it must have been he must have been such a depressed and sad person also, because especially since this, as he says in the Heiligenstadt Testament, this is the one sense that I need, and this is the one sense that that should be more, as he said, it should be so much more here. In the one sense that it should be more perfect in me than in others. And that's the sense, that is leaving him.
Well, we know why he drank.
Yeah, right.
Evan would like to know, did he have an influence on Wagner, and what did Wagner think of Beethoven?
Oh, yeah. He had an influence of Wagner. The thing, of course, is Wagner is alive or Wagner comes, but Wagner is born. That's what I wanted to say. He's born in 1813. So that is, when Ludwig is already 43. And so let's see. And so basically, Wagner is a teenager. Wagner is 13 years old when Beethoven dies. And since Beethoven was such an iconic figure, and Wagner was very influenced by Beethoven, and he adored the music also. Yeah.
Okay. Cynthia would like to know, was the birth of the baby girl ever questioned by the immortal beloved's husband?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't really know. If there was, if he
counts.
I mean, the fact that he is actually leaving her and leaving her destitute and taking all of her children away from her doesn't really bode well. I mean, one could say that he must have had quite the resentment against her.
Okay, last question. Andrea would like to know, did Beethoven know his music was great? Did he have a clue as to exactly how incredibly moving and iconic his work was, although he would not have used the word iconic?
Yes. The short answer is yes. He was, as I said, self-confidence or a lack of self-confidence was not one of Beethoven's problems. He was very aware, especially also, things like the Ninth Symphony. There was this moment, the Ninth Symphony, he had all his hopes, on the success of the Ninth Symphony, and also financially, because at that point, remember that I said that they were called academies, they were not called concerts, and so the musicians who were creating these, who were kind of putting these concerts on, they actually had to organize all of it. So it wasn't as if you had music impresarios or something. No, you as the composer, you had to organize the orchestra musicians. You had to pay rent for the music hall. You had to sell the tickets and everything. And so Beethoven had figured out that it was that this was such a successful thing. He at least would have gotten 2,000 gulden. So that was the thing. And he thought, oh, 2,000 gulden is so much money that I'm getting somewhere with these 2,000 gulden. And then at the end, unfortunately, everything turned out to be so much more expensive that at the end of the concert, after everybody was so happy, and he was then bowing, and he was then going to the head of that theater and said, okay, so how much money do I have over, from that experience? It was only 400 gulden. And then Beethoven at that time, on that day, right there in the theater, had a nervous breakdown. And he cried, and he just had really like a nervous breakdown, because maybe also it was the premiere and he was nervous about it and he couldn't hear anything anyway. So, but yeah, because he always thought, I mean, this music is so important and I'm so much better than everybody else. And now I only get 400 instead of the 2,000 that I thought I was going to get.
Annette, thank you so much. This was so wonderful.
Thank you, Wendy.
Everyone, thank you so much for attending and sharing your thoughts with us. I will be sending out a short survey later today. The encore presentation will be up on YouTube tomorrow. And this was just a wonderful way to celebrate Beethoven's birthday and to end have the final lecture for what's been a really crazy year.
Yeah.
We hope that 2021 is going to be much better.
Right.
Please, everyone, thank you, Abidor Evanston again. Thank you, Levy Senior Center Foundation. Thank you for attending our webinars and being supportive of the Levy Senior Center Foundation. We will see you right back here on Tuesday, January 5th. We have a great season coming up, and Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Festivus, and have a wonderful new year. Stay safe. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.